Get that filthy animal away from my patient, or I swear to God I'll have security put a bullet in its skull right here in this hallway. Dr. Nathan Cross's voice cracked with fury as he shoved a young nurse aside his expensive watch, glinting under the fluorescent lights. He yanked a sedation kit from the crash cart, his face purple with rage. The German shepherd's growl deepened a warning. Cross didn't care. He charged forward, syringe raised like a weapon. I don't care what the VA says about service dogs. This is my floor, and that mutt just became a medical waste problem. Behind him, the quiet night nurse everyone ignored. Grace Miller stepped forward. Her voice came out calm, cold, carrying weight nobody expected from a tired woman in wrinkled scrubs. Touch that dog and you'll regret it. Cross spun around sneering. He had no idea who he was really talking to. Before we continue with Grace's story, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to the night that changed everything. The call had come in 47 minutes earlier. Grace had been restocking gauze in the supply closet when she heard the commotion in the emergency intake area raise voices, the skittering of claws on linoleum, and underneath it all, a sound that made her entire body tense with recognition, the low, steady growl of a military working dog on high alert. She'd moved quickly down the hallway, her orthopedic shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. The scene that greeted her was chaos barely contained. A veteran, maybe 30 years old, sat hunched in a wheelchair, his entire body rigid with the kind of tension Grace had seen 1,000 times before. His eyes were unfocused, darting between the fluorescent lights overhead and the faces of the medical staff surrounding him. His breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Classic acute PTSD, episode severe dissociation, probable flashback state. But what held Grace's attention was the dog. The German shepherd, his vest identified him as Ranger, stood with his body positioned between his handler and every approaching staff member. His ears were forward, his stance low and ready, but his eyes held something Grace recognized immediately. This wasn't aggression. This was protection. This was a working dog doing exactly what he'd been trained to do, keep his handler safe when that handler couldn't keep himself safe. "Sir, you need to calm down," one of the younger doctors was saying, his voice rising with each word. "We can't help you if you don't let us approach." The veteran his intake paperwork identified him as Ethan Walker. Army, 2 tours Afghanistan, didn't respond. He was somewhere else entirely, his mind trapped in whatever hell he was reliving. His hands gripped the wheelchair arms so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Ranger's growl deepened as the doctor took another step forward. "I said back off," the dog's body language screamed, though no one else in that hallway seemed to understand the language. Grace had moved closer slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Stop," she'd said quietly to the young doctor. "You're escalating him." The doctor had looked at her with barely concealed annoyance. "Excuse me. The dog isn't being aggressive. He's doing his job. The veteran is in a severe dissociative state, probably thinks he's back in combat. Every time you approach the dog, interprets it as a threat to his handler. You need to give them space." "I don't take medical advice from nurses," the doctor had snapped, "especially about psychiatry." That's when Dr. Nathan Cross had arrived, sweeping into the hallway with the kind of self-important stride that Grace had learned to despise over her 15 years at Cascade Veterans Medical Center. Cross was 42, handsome in a practiced way, with expensive haircuts and a reputation for publishing papers about veteran trauma while treating actual veterans like inconvenient data points. He'd assessed the situation for maybe 10 seconds before making his pronouncement. "Separate them. The dog goes to holding, the patient goes to psychiatric restraint. We'll sedate and assess once he's secured." "That's the worst possible approach," Grace had said, her voice still quiet but carrying a note of authority that made several staff members turn to look at her. "That dog is the only anchor keeping him from complete psychological collapse. If you separate them now, you'll trigger a full crisis response." Cross had looked at her the way someone might look at a particularly slow child. "Miss Miller, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a board-certified psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma. I think I know slightly more about this than a night shift nurse with an associate degree. Now please step back and let the professionals handle this." The dismissal had been absolute. Grace had felt the familiar burn of being invisible, of having decades of experience reduced to nothing because she didn't have the right letters after her name. But she'd also felt something else rising in her chest, the old familiar anger she'd buried 15 years ago, along with her medals and her combat boots, and the memories of pulling wounded SEALs out of firefights while treating her own canine partner's shrapnel wounds with one hand. She'd stepped back, but she'd also pulled out her phone and started documenting everything. The separation had gone exactly as badly as Grace had predicted. The moment security guards approached with a catch-pole for Ranger, the dog's protective stance shifted into active defense. Ethan, pulled partially out of his dissociative state by the commotion, had lurched out of the wheelchair with a scream that echoed down the hallway. Not words, just pure anguished terror. Contact, IED, get down! He'd hit the floor hard, covering his head with his arms, his entire body convulsing. Ranger had lunged between his handler and the security guards, not biting, but creating a physical barrier with his body. The guards had grabbed the catch-pole around his neck anyway, dragging the dog backward, while he fought and twisted his eyes, never leaving Ethan. Grace had watched Cross through all of this, watched him not flinch, not reassess, not show even a flicker of doubt about his approach. He'd simply nodded to the head nurse. Get him in 4-point restraints, start with 5 milligrams Haldol, and 2 of Ativan. If he continues to be combative, we'll add ketamine. Dr. Cross, Grace had tried again, knowing it was futile, but unable to stop herself. I'm formally documenting my objection to this treatment plan. The patient's documented history includes adverse reactions to haloperidol, and his current state is a trauma response, not psychosis. Sedating him while he's this dysregulated. Your objection is noted and dismissed, Cross had said without even looking at her. Now either help or get out of the way. Grace had helped. She had had no choice. But she'd helped while documenting every single protocol violation, every ignored warning, every moment of negligence. She'd taken timestamps. She'd noted witnesses. She'd photographed the patient's medication chart where it clearly stated adverse reaction to Haldol in bold red letters. And she'd listened to Ranger howling from the holding area 3 floors down, a sound of such pure, desperate anguish that several staff members had to leave the floor. 4 hours later, Ethan Walker was in a private room, restrained at all 4 points, sedated into a stupor that left him mumbling incoherently. Grace had been assigned to his care, which meant checking vitals every 15 minutes and documenting his status. On her second check, his eyes had flickered open. For just a moment, they'd been clear and present. He'd looked directly at Grace, and she'd seen the recognition there, not of her specifically, but of what she was. Nurse, caretaker, maybe safe. Ranger, he'd whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. Where's Ranger? I need. He's safe. Grace had lied gently because what else could she say? That his service dog was locked in a concrete holding cell, probably traumatizing himself, trying to get back to his handler. He's being taken care of. Can't breathe without him. He knows when it's coming. Please, I need. Then the sedation had pulled him back under, his eyes rolling back, his breathing becoming shallow and labored. Grace had checked his oxygen saturation. 92%, lower than it should be, but not critical. She'd made a note on his chart and continued her rounds. But something had gnawed at her. Something about the way he was breathing, the slight bluish tint developing around his lips, the way his restrained hands had started to twitch. She'd gone back 15 minutes later. Oxygen sat at 88%. I need a doctor in here, she'd called to the hallway. Patients decompensating. The resident who responded was barely 30, exhausted from a double shift. He'd glanced at the monitors at Ethan's sedated form. He's fine, probably just respiratory depression from the medication cocktail. Watch him call me if he drops below 85. He's having an adverse reaction, Grace had pressed. We need to reverse the sedation and reassess. Dr. Cross's orders were clear. Patient stays sedated until psychiatric eval in the morning. The resident had left. Grace had stayed watching the monitors, watching Ethan's chest rise and fall in increasingly labored movements. She'd pulled out her phone and called the one person she'd sworn she'd never burden with her hospital politics, her daughter. Captain Olivia Miller had answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. Mom, what's wrong? I need you to document something through military channels, Grace had said quietly, stepping into the hallway. Patient name Ethan Walker, Army veteran, 2 tours Afghanistan. Cascade Veterans Medical Center is violating VA treatment protocols for PTSD crisis intervention. They separated him from his service animal despite documented evidence that this would trigger severe psychological deterioration. They administered contraindicated medications. They have him in 4-point restraints while he's experiencing respiratory depression. And when this goes wrong, not if, when they're going to call it complications from his underlying condition and bury it. Olivia had been silent for 3 seconds. Then, Mom, are you sure about this? Because if you're right and you file this, your career at that hospital is over. They'll destroy you. I know. And if you're wrong, I'm not wrong, Liv. I've seen this before, too many times. I'm not watching another veteran die because some doctor's ego was more important than the patient's actual needs. Another pause. Then Olivia's voice had shifted into the crisp, professional tone she used when she was acting as an officer. Send me everything you have. I'll route it through appropriate channels. Mom, be careful, these things get ugly. I will. But Grace had known even then that careful wasn't going to be enough. She'd gone back to Ethan's room to find his oxygen saturation at 84%. His lips were definitely blue now. His restrained body was starting to jerk in small, involuntary movements. She'd hit the code button without hesitation. The response team had arrived in 90 seconds. Dr. Cross had arrived 2 minutes after that, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, his eyes sharp and immediately assessing the situation. What happened? He demanded. Patients in respiratory distress, Grace had reported crisply. Oxygen sat dropped from 92 to 84 in 30 minutes. Increasing cyanosis, involuntary muscle movements, suggesting neurological involvement. I believe he's having a severe adverse reaction to the medication combination. Cross had checked the chart, his face impassive. He has a history of substance abuse, probably pulmonary damage from that. Get him on high-flow oxygen, run a blood gas, and page pulmonology. We should reverse the sedation, Grace had said, giving him a chance to breathe on his own. Absolutely not. If we reverse now while he's still agitated, he'll tear out his lines and potentially harm himself or staff. We treat the symptom, not change the plan. Grace had opened her mouth to argue, but the code team had already moved in following Cross's orders. High-flow oxygen, blood draw for arterial blood gas, page to pulmonology. Everything by the book. Everything technically correct. Everything except listening to the patient's own body, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Grace had stepped back, her hands shaking slightly. She'd looked at Ethan's face, slack and bluish under the oxygen mask, and she'd thought about another face 15 years ago. A SEAL named Marcus Chen, bleeding out from a femoral artery wound in a mud brick compound outside Kandahar. She'd been the only medic available, and she'd saved his life with a combat tourniquet and pressure while mortars fell around them. She'd been 28 years old and absolutely certain she could save anyone. Now she was 53, and she knew better. Sometimes you couldn't save them. Sometimes the system was designed to fail them. But sometimes you could at least make sure their death wasn't invisible. She'd pulled out her phone again and documented everything. The timeline, the medication orders, Cross's refusal to reverse sedation, the resident's dismissal of her concerns. Every single failure point. 2 hours later, Ethan Walker went into cardiac arrest. The code team had worked on him for 47 minutes. Grace had done chest compressions for 6 of those minutes, her arms burning her mind somewhere else entirely back in that compound, back with Marcus Chen, back when she'd believed that trying hard enough meant you could win. They'd called it at 4:47 a.m. Dr. Cross had stripped off his gloves and addressed the exhausted code team with practiced solemnity. Unfortunate outcome. Patient presented with multiple comorbidities, documented substance abuse history, probable undiagnosed cardiac condition, severe psychological trauma. We did everything medically possible. I'll notify next of kin and complete the mortality report. He turned to leave, then paused. Miss Miller, I'll need your nursing notes completed and submitted within the hour, standard protocol. Grace had looked at him, really looked at him. At the complete absence of doubt in his eyes, the total certainty that he'd done nothing wrong. That Ethan Walker's death was just an unfortunate complication, a sad statistic, a paragraph in a mortality report. Of course, doctor, she'd said quietly. She'd completed her notes. Every single detail, every warning she'd given, every protocol that had been violated, every moment of negligence documented in clear, precise medical language. And then she'd attached them to the email to her daughter and added one more recipient, the Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. She'd hit send at 5:23 a.m. By 5:24 a.m., she'd known her life at Cascade Veterans Medical Center was over. By 5:25 a.m., she'd known she didn't care. The sun had been starting to rise when Grace had finally walked down to the holding area where Ranger was kept. The K-9 had been curled in the corner of the concrete cell, his body tense and shaking. When Grace had opened the door, he'd lunged to his feet, eyes wild, searching for Ethan. "I'm sorry," Grace had whispered, kneeling down. "I'm so sorry. He's gone." The dog had stared at her for a long moment. Then he'd made a sound Grace had heard before in a different desert from a different military working dog. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, just pure grief made audible. Ranger had collapsed against her, his body heaving, and Grace had wrapped her arms around him and finally let herself cry for all of them. For Ethan Walker, who'd survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, only to die in an American hospital because no one would listen. For Ranger, who'd done his job perfectly and lost his handler anyway. For every veteran she'd watched fall through the cracks of a system that praised them in speeches and failed them in practice. And for herself. For the Navy SEAL combat medics she'd buried 15 years ago, the woman who'd believed she could save everyone, who'd learned the hard way that sometimes courage wasn't enough. The door to the holding area had opened behind her. Grace had looked up to see Amanda Chen, another night nurse, standing there with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. "Grace," Amanda had said softly, "what did you do?" "What I should have done years ago," Grace had answered, still holding the grieving dog. "I told the truth. Dr. Cross is furious. He's talking about having you fired for insubordination. There's already an HR meeting scheduled for this afternoon." "I know. They're going to destroy you. You know that, right? Cross has friends on the hospital board. They'll make sure you never work in nursing again." Grace had stood up slowly, her knees protesting, every one of her 53 years evident in the movement. "Let them try." "Why?" Amanda had asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Why would you throw away your career for one patient? You can't save them all, Grace. You know that better than anyone." "Maybe not," Grace had said, "but I can make damn sure everyone knows why this one died." She'd left Ranger with the night veterinary tech with instructions to contact the military working dog unit for transfer procedures. Then she'd gone to the locker room, changed out of her scrubs for the last time, and driven home as the Seattle morning traffic started to build. Her apartment had been quiet. She'd made coffee. She'd sat at her small kitchen table and stared at the wall where she'd hung a single photograph herself, 15 years younger, in desert camouflage, crouched next to a Belgian Malinois named Havoc. Behind them, barely visible in the photo, you could see 3 Navy SEALs giving thumbs up. That photo was the only evidence in her entire apartment that she'd ever been anyone other than quiet, invisible Grace Miller, night shift nurse. Her phone had rung at 8:47 a.m. "Olivia. Mom, what the hell did you send me?" "The truth. Mom, this is documentation of systematic negligence. If even half of this is accurate, you are not talking about one doctor making a mistake. You're talking about institutional failure." "I know. The Inspector General is going to investigate, which means the hospital is going to lawyer up, which means they're going to come after you with everything they have. They'll question your competence, your mental state, your judgment. They'll dig into your past." Grace had felt something cold settle in her chest. "Let them." "Mom," Olivia's voice had cracked slightly, "if they find out about Afghanistan, about what happened to you over there, they'll use it against you. They'll say you're unstable, that you have unresolved trauma, that you can't be trusted. Every ugly thing you've spent 15 years trying to forget, they'll drag it all out and make it public." "I know." "Then why?" "Because Ethan Walker does dead live. Because he died scared and alone and restrained like an animal while his service dog howled 3 floors down. Because I watched it happen and I knew it was wrong and I said something and no one listened. And if I stay quiet now, if I let them bury this with a mortality report and some platitudes about how sad it is that veterans struggle, then what was the point? What was the point of surviving Afghanistan if I come home and watch veterans die anyway and don't do a damn thing about it?" Silence on the line. "Then okay, I'm with you, whatever you need." "I need you to stay out of it," Grace had said firmly. "This is my fight. You have a career to protect. You're my mother. I'm also a veteran. I knew what I was signing up for when I sent that email. This is my battle, Liv, not yours. They'd argued for another 10 minutes before Olivia had reluctantly agreed to step back, at least publicly. Grace had known her daughter well enough to know that stepping back probably meant working every back channel she had access to, but she'd appreciated the gesture anyway. The HR meeting had been scheduled for 2 p.m. Grace had shown up 15 minutes early, dressed in slacks, in a simple blouse carrying a folder with copies of every piece of documentation she'd submitted. The hospital's legal team had been waiting. 3 lawyers, the HR director, and Dr. Cross, looking simultaneously furious and supremely confident. They'd made their position clear in the first 5 minutes. Grace had violated patient confidentiality by reporting to outside agencies without following proper internal channels. She'd undermined a physician's medical decisions. She'd caused disruption to hospital operations. She'd demonstrated emotional instability and poor judgment. They were suspending her immediately pending a full investigation. They were recommending termination. They were considering legal action for defamation. Grace had listened to all of it without speaking. When they'd finished, the lead lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Holloway, had leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Miller, we're prepared to offer you a settlement. 6 months' salary, excellent references, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. You withdraw your complaint to the Inspector General. We forget this incident ever happened, and you move on with your life. Otherwise, this gets very ugly for you. No, Grace had said simply. Holloway's smile had frozen. I'm sorry. No, I don't want your money or your references. I don't want to sign anything that keeps me from telling the truth about what happened to Ethan Walker. Miss Miller, Dr. Cross had interjected, his voice condescending. I understand you're upset. Losing a patient is never easy, but you're allowing your emotions to cloud your judgment. You're throwing away your career over a misguided sense of, I watched a veteran die because you were too arrogant to listen to anyone who didn't have the right credentials. Grace had interrupted, her voice still quiet but carrying a steel edge that made Cross blink. I documented every warning I gave you, every protocol you violated, every moment you prioritized your ego over your patient's well-being. And now you want to pay me to pretend it didn't happen. You're a nurse, Cross had snapped, his facade of professionalism cracking. You don't get to question my medical decisions. You don't have the training or the expertise or the authority. You're right, Grace had said. I'm just a nurse, just a tired middle-aged woman with an associate degree who works nights because I don't have the ambition for anything better. That's what you see when you look at me, isn't it? Cross hadn't answered, but his expression had said enough. Grace had stood up, gathering her folder. Well, here's what you don't see, Dr. Cross. You don't see the combat medic who spent 3 tours treating battlefield trauma in conditions you couldn't imagine. You don't see the K9 handler who understands exactly what that dog was trying to tell you. You don't see the woman who has watched enough good people die to know the difference between an unavoidable tragedy and preventable negligence. She'd walked to the door, then paused. I'm not withdrawing anything, and when the investigation is done, everyone is going to know exactly why Ethan Walker died. Not because of his PTSD, not because of his service, but because this hospital prioritizes protecting doctors over protecting patients. She'd left before they could respond. The next 3 days had been a blur. The story had leaked somehow. Grace suspected Amanda, who'd always had connections to the local veterans advocacy groups. By day 2, there were protesters outside the hospital. By day 3, the media had picked it up. Veteran dies after hospital separates him from service dog. The hospital had issued a statement expressing sympathy and promising a thorough internal review. Dr. Cross had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. And then the lawyers had started digging into Grace's past. Grace sat in her apartment watching the news coverage when her phone rang. Number blocked. She'd answered anyway. Hello, Grace Miller, male voice professional. This is James Patterson with Cascade's legal department. I wanted to give you a courtesy heads up before the hospital makes this public. In the course of our investigation into your allegations, we've obtained your military service records through a FOIA request. We know about the incident in Kandahar. We know about the Article 15 you received. We know about the psychiatric evaluation and the PTSD diagnosis. Grace's hand had tightened on the phone. Patterson had continued, his voice almost sympathetic. We know you're not the objective, reliable witness you're presenting yourself as. You're a veteran with severe, unresolved trauma who's projecting your own issues onto your patients. The hospital plans to release this information to demonstrate why your version of events can't be trusted. We wanted to give you one last chance to take the settlement before your whole painful history becomes public record. Think about it, Miss Miller. Do you really want everyone to know what happened to you over there? Do you want your daughter to see the psychiatric reports? Do you want the world to know about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the reasons you walked away from military medicine? Grace had been quiet for a long moment. Then when are you releasing it? Tomorrow morning, unless you sign the agreement tonight. Release it, Grace had said. Miss Miller, you think I'm ashamed of Afghanistan? You think I'm ashamed of getting PTSD after pulling wounded soldiers out of firefights while my own K-9 partner bled out next to me? You think that makes me less credible? She'd laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Release everything, every psychiatric evaluation, every Article 15, every ugly, painful detail. Because you know what? It's going to prove exactly what I've been saying, that I know what combat trauma looks like, that I know what a veteran in crisis needs, that I know what happens when the people who are supposed to help decide their procedures and protocols matter more than the patient's actual experience. You're making a mistake, Patterson had said. No, Grace had answered. I'm done hiding. Release it all. She'd hung up. The next morning, the hospital had released a statement. Grace Miller, the nurse making allegations against Dr. Cross and Cascade Veterans Medical Center, had a history of severe PTSD from her military service. She'd received psychiatric care for nightmares, anxiety, and emotional dysregulation. She'd been given a general discharge from the Navy after an incident where she'd allegedly disobeyed orders to evacuate so she could continue treating wounded soldiers. Her mental health history raised serious questions about her reliability as a witness. The statement had included excerpts from her psychiatric evaluations, private medical information made public to discredit her. For about 6 hours it had worked. The media narrative had shifted. Maybe she was unstable. Maybe her trauma had clouded her judgment. Maybe the hospital was right to question her account. And then Grace had done something she'd sworn she'd never do. She'd held a press conference. She'd held a press conference at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, standing outside the Seattle Veterans Affairs building with her daughter in full Army dress uniform beside her. Olivia hadn't asked permission. She'd simply shown up, stood at attention, and refused to leave. The reporters had expected a broken woman. Someone defensive, apologetic, maybe crying about her PTSD diagnosis being exposed. They got Grace Miller instead. My name is Grace Miller. I'm a Navy veteran, a former combat medic, and yes, I have PTSD from my service in Afghanistan. The hospital released my private medical records to discredit my account of what happened to Ethan Walker. So let me tell you exactly what those records say and why they prove I was right. Her voice hadn't wavered. The cameras had pressed closer. In 2009, I was serving with a SEAL team outside Kandahar. We came under heavy fire during a medical evacuation. My K-9 partner, a Belgian Malinois named Havoc, took shrapnel protecting wounded soldiers. I had two choices: evacuate with the team as ordered or stay behind and try to save both Havoc and 3 wounded SEALs who couldn't be moved. I stayed. I performed field surgery on Havoc while treating sucking chest wounds on 2 SEALs and a shattered femur on the 3rd. We held that position for 4 hours under intermittent fire until extraction arrived. She'd paused, letting that sink in. All 3 SEALs survived. Havoc died in my arms 20 minutes after we reached the field hospital. I received an Article 15 for disobeying evacuation orders. I also received a Navy Commendation Medal for saving those 3 lives. The psychiatric evaluation the hospital is using against me, that was mandatory screening after Havoc died. Yes, I had nightmares. Yes, I had panic attacks. Yes, I struggled. And yes, I got help worked through it and spent the next 6 years continuing to serve before I chose to leave the military on my own terms. Grace had looked directly into the cameras. So when Cascade Veterans Medical Center says my PTSD makes me unreliable, here's what they're really saying: that surviving combat trauma somehow erases my medical expertise. That getting help for mental health issues means I can't be trusted. That the very experiences that taught me how to recognize veteran crisis should be used to silence me. They're wrong. A reporter had called out, Miss Miller, the hospital claims you became emotionally involved with the patient, that you let your own trauma interfere with professional judgment. I became involved the moment I saw a veteran in crisis being treated like a behavioral problem instead of a human being in pain. And yes, I used my combat trauma experience to recognize what Dr. Cross missed, that Ethan Walker wasn't aggressive or psychotic. He was having a severe PTSD flashback, and his service dog was doing exactly what that dog was trained to do: protect his handler until the threat passed. The threat wasn't other patients or staff. The threat was the flashback itself. And the only thing anchoring Ethan to reality was Ranger. Another reporter. What would you have done differently? I would have listened to the dog. I would have cleared the hallway, dimmed the lights, and given them space. I would have had someone who understood K9 behavior approach, slowly speaking, calmly, giving Ethan time to come back to himself. I would have checked his medication history before pumping him full of drugs he was documented as having adverse reactions to. I would have treated him like a combat veteran in crisis instead of an inconvenient disruption to hospital routine. Grace had pulled out a folder. I have documentation here, timestamps showing I warned Dr. Cross about the medication contraindications. Nursing notes showing I formally objected to the treatment plan. Witness statements from other staff members who heard me raise concerns. The hospital wants to make this about my mental health. Fine. Let's talk about Dr. Cross's decision-making instead. That's when Patricia Holloway had appeared flanked by hospital security. Miss Miller, you're in violation of your suspension terms by speaking publicly about an ongoing investigation. You need to stop immediately or we'll pursue legal action. Olivia had stepped forward, her captain's bars catching the sunlight. Ma'am, my mother is a private citizen exercising her First Amendment rights on public property. If you attempt to interfere, I'll personally file a complaint with the Judge Advocate General's office for witness intimidation against a veteran. Holloway's face had gone rigid. Captain Miller, I'd be very careful about getting involved in your mother's legal issues. That sounds like a threat against a uniformed military officer, ma'am, in front of multiple witnesses and cameras. Would you like to rephrase that? The standoff had lasted maybe 10 seconds before Holloway had turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Grace had continued. Ethan Walker deserved better. Every veteran who walks through those hospital doors deserves better. And if exposing my own painful history is what it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again, then I'll stand here and tell you everything. Every nightmare, every panic attack, every moment of struggling to reconcile the person I was in combat with the person I became afterward. Because that struggle, that's not weakness. That's the cost of service. And it doesn't make me less qualified to speak up when I see negligence. It makes me more qualified. The press conference had lasted 47 minutes. By the time Grace had finished, she'd walked through every detail of Ethan's case, every warning she'd given, every protocol violation she'd documented. The media narrative had shifted again. This time it stuck. Within 24 hours, 3 other Cascade nurses had come forward with their own stories. Dr. Cross had a pattern, they said. He dismissed nursing concerns routinely. He prioritized his own judgment over patient history. He'd been involved in at least 4 other veteran cases where outcomes had been questionable. Amanda Chen had been one of them. She'd appeared on the local news, her voice shaking but determined. Grace Miller is the most competent, dedicated nurse I've ever worked with. And I've watched her try to advocate for patients for 15 years only to be shut down by doctors who think their medical degree means they can't possibly learn anything from a nurse. What happened to Ethan Walker wasn't an isolated incident. It was inevitable. The Veterans Affairs Inspector General had accelerated the investigation. The media had started digging into Cross's history. Turns out he'd published extensively about veteran PTSD treatment while having one of the worst patient satisfaction ratings in the entire VA system. His research focused on pharmaceutical interventions. He had financial ties to 3 different drug companies. The hospital had tried to contain it, but the story had grown too big. Veterans groups had mobilized. Former SEALs who'd served with Grace in Afghanistan had started speaking out. One of them, Marcus Chen, the same SEAL whose life she'd saved with a combat tourniquet, had posted a video that went viral. Grace Miller kept me alive long enough to see my daughters grow up. She did it while under fire, while injured, herself, while her own K9 partner was dying. And now some hospital administrator wants to question her judgment, her mental fitness. Let me tell you about mental fitness. Grace has more courage and clarity in her worst nightmare than most people have on their best day. If she says a veteran died because nobody listened, then a veteran died because nobody listened. Period. The video had gotten 2 million views in 3 days, but the pressure on Grace had intensified too. The hospital's lawyers had filed a defamation suit. They'd subpoenaed her personal records, her therapy notes, her financial information. They were clearly trying to bury her in legal costs, force her to settle. Grace had responded by filing her own lawsuit, wrongful termination retaliation, for whistleblowing violation of veteran protection statutes. Her lawyer, a former JAG officer named Sarah Kim, had taken the case pro bono. They screwed up the moment they made this about your PTSD, Sarah had explained during their first meeting, because now it's not just about one patient death. It's about systematic discrimination against veterans in healthcare. That's a federal case. That's the kind of thing that gets congressional attention. She'd been right. By week 2, a congressional staffer had reached out requesting Grace's testimony for a committee hearing on VA hospital oversight. But Sarah had also warned her, Grace, you need to understand what's coming. They're going to put you on that stand and try to break you. They'll ask about every traumatic incident from Afghanistan, every therapy session, every moment of weakness. They'll try to make you cry, make you angry, make you look unstable. Can you handle that? Grace had thought about Ethan Walker restrained and terrified and dying while his service dog howled 3 floors away. Yes, the deposition had been scheduled for a Monday morning. Grace had arrived at the law offices at 8 a.m. wearing simple professional clothes, no makeup, her graying hair pulled back. Cross's legal team had 6 people at the table. Grace had Sarah and a court reporter. The lead attorney, a man named Robert Vance with silver hair and an expensive suit, had started gently. Background questions, her nursing education, her work history, just establishing baseline. Then he'd shifted. Miss Miller, let's talk about your time in Afghanistan, specifically the incident on March 7th, 2009. You disobeyed a direct order to evacuate, correct? I made a medical judgment that 3 wounded soldiers couldn't be safely moved without stabilization. A judgment your commanding officer disagreed with. My commanding officer wasn't a medic. He didn't have the medical training to assess their condition. But he had the military authority to give you orders. He did. And you chose to disobey those orders. I chose to save 3 lives. Vance had smiled slightly. A pattern of believing you know better than your superiors. Would you say that's accurate? Sarah had objected. Relevance. It goes to the witness's tendency to substitute her judgment for established authority figures, which directly relates to her interactions with Dr. Cross. The deposition officer had allowed it. Vance had continued. After that incident, you underwent psychiatric evaluation. The report mentions severe anxiety, intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance. Does that sound accurate? Yes. And those symptoms continued for years afterward. They improved with treatment, but they never fully resolved, did they? In fact, your medical records show you were still receiving therapy as recently as 2018. Getting therapy isn't a sign of instability. It's a sign of taking care of my mental health. Or it's a sign of ongoing psychological issues that might affect your professional judgment. Grace had felt her jaw tighten. Sarah had put a hand on her arm, a silent warning to stay calm. Vance had pulled out another document. Let's talk about your relationship with your K-9 partner, Havoc. You described his death as the most traumatic experience of your military service. More traumatic than being under fire, more traumatic than treating wounded soldiers. A dog's death affected you more than human casualties. Doesn't that seem like a disproportionate emotional response? Havoc saved my life and the lives of my team multiple times. He was my partner. Losing him was devastating. And when you saw Ethan Walker's service dog Ranger, did that bring back memories of Havoc? Grace had seen the trap. I recognized Ranger's behavior as protective rather than aggressive because of my K-9 handling experience. But you also had an emotional response, didn't you? Seeing that dog in distress reminded you of losing Havoc. It clouded your judgment. My judgment was based on medical and behavioral observation, not emotion. Really, because your nursing notes use language like clearly distressed and desperately trying to protect. That sounds emotional to me. That's descriptive language accurately reflecting the situation. Vance had leaned forward. Miss Miller, isn't it true that you projected your own unresolved trauma onto Ethan Walker's case, that you saw havoc when you looked at Ranger and you saw yourself when you looked at Ethan, and that emotional identification led you to overreact to standard psychiatric protocols? No, you didn't feel a personal connection to this case. I felt a professional obligation to advocate for appropriate care. But you went beyond advocacy, didn't you? You filed complaints with federal agencies. You contacted your daughter in the military to create pressure. You documented every interaction with Dr. Cross like you were building a legal case rather than simply doing your job. That's not professional obligation. That's personal vendetta. Sarah had objected. Argumentative. But Vance had made his point. He'd spent the next 3 hours hammering the same themes. Grace was emotionally unstable. Grace had boundary issues with patients. Grace let her trauma interfere with her work. Grace had a history of defying authority. By hour 4, Grace's head had been pounding. Her hands folded on the table had started to shake slightly, a stress response she hadn't been able to fully control since Afghanistan. Vance had noticed. Of course he'd noticed. Miss Miller, are you experiencing anxiety right now? I'm fine. Your hands are shaking. Are you having a PTSD response to these questions? Sarah had stood up. We're taking a break. Now. They'd stepped into the hallway. Sarah had looked at Grace with concern. You okay? I'm fine. Grace, you're pale and shaking. If you need to stop. I'm not stopping. That's exactly what he wants. He wants me to fall apart so he can point to it as proof that I'm unstable. You don't have to be superhuman here. It's okay to be affected by this. Grace had taken a slow breath. When I was in Afghanistan, there was this SEAL, not Marcus, different guy, who got hit with shrapnel in his abdomen. Perf, orated bowel massive internal bleeding. He knew he was dying, and you know what he said to me while I was trying to stop the bleeding? He said, "Doc, don't let them paint," I cried. Not save me, not tell my family I love them. He wanted to make sure that when they wrote up his death, nobody would say he showed weakness. She'd looked at Sarah. I couldn't save him. He died on that medevac helicopter. But I made damn sure the report said he was brave until the end, because that mattered to him. And this matters to me. I'm not giving them the satisfaction of breaking me. They'd gone back in. Vance had continued for another 2 hours, but Grace had held steady. Every question about her trauma she'd redirected to her expertise. Every attempt to paint her as emotional, she'd countered with documentation and facts. Finally, Vance had switched tactics. Let's talk about Dr. Cross. You described him as arrogant, dismissive, and negligent. Those are strong words. They're accurate words. You don't think there's any possibility you simply didn't understand his medical reasoning, that perhaps his years of psychiatric training gave him insights you lacked. His years of psychiatric training should have taught him to check medication contraindications before ordering Haldol for a patient with documented adverse reactions. Mistakes happen in medicine. That wasn't a mistake. That was choosing convenience over safety. He wanted Ethan sedated quickly so he didn't have to deal with a difficult case. He ignored every warning because listening would have required him to change his approach. Or perhaps you're so used to distrusting authority from your military service, from your experiences with male doctors, that you interpreted standard medical practice as negligence. Grace had felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Are you seriously suggesting I accused a doctor of killing a patient because of some kind of feminist grudge? I'm suggesting your history of conflict with superiors combined with unresolved trauma created a situation where you couldn't objectively assess Dr. Cross's decisions. Then explain the other nurses who came forward. Explain the pattern of complaints against Cross. Explain why Ethan Walker's family is suing the hospital. Are we all just traumatized women with authority issues? Vance had paused just for a second. Grace had seen it, the flicker of uncertainty. She'd pressed forward. You want to make this about my mental health? Fine. Let's talk about what my PTSD actually taught me. It taught me what panic looks like from the inside. It taught me the difference between aggression and fear. It taught me that sometimes the person who looks the most out of control is actually fighting the hardest to hold on. And it taught me that the people who dismiss trauma as weakness are usually the ones who've never had to face anything that truly tested them. Miss Miller, I'm not finished. You want to know if seeing Ranger reminded me of havoc? Yes. Every K-9 reminds me of havoc. Every veteran in crisis reminds me of soldiers I couldn't save. Every time I walk into that hospital, I'm reminded that I survived when people braver than me didn't. And you know what? That doesn't make me less qualified to do my job. It makes me better at it, because I remember what it counts. I remember what happens when the people in charge decide their procedures matter more than the patient's humanity. The room had gone quiet. Grace had looked directly at Vance. So yes, I have PTSD. Yes, I sometimes have nightmares about Afghanistan. Yes, I went to therapy and worked through trauma and still carry scars. And none of that changes the fact that Ethan Walker died because a doctor was too arrogant to listen to a nurse. You can spend as many hours as you want trying to paint me as crazy, but the documentation speaks for itself. I warned Dr. Cross. He ignored me. Ethan died. Those are facts, not trauma responses. Vance had looked down at his notes. When he'd looked back up, something in his expression had shifted. No further questions. The deposition had ended at 6:47 p.m. Grace had walked out of that office with her head high and her hands still shaking, knowing she'd survived, but unsure if she'd won. Sarah had walked her to her car. That was either the best or worst deposition I've ever witnessed. I'm honestly not sure which. Did I hurt the case? You made yourself very difficult to cross-examine at trial. You owned everything they tried to use against you. But you also gave them sound bites they'll use to paint you as combative and emotional. So we'll see. We'll see. Grace had driven home in the dark, exhausted to her bones. When she'd walked into her apartment, Olivia had been waiting, sitting on the couch with 2 glasses of wine already poured. Mom, how did you... Sarah called me, said you were intense. Grace had taken the wine sunk onto the couch beside her daughter. I might have gone too far. You think he was trying to break me live, trying to make me cry or lose my temper or fall apart so they could point to it as proof that I'm unstable. And I got angry instead. Good. Grace had looked at her daughter in surprise. Olivia had smiled slightly. Mom, you've spent your entire adult life making yourself small, making yourself quiet, hiding everything that makes you exceptional because you learned that exceptional women get punished. You buried your medals in a drawer. You never talk about Afghanistan. You let people treat you like you're invisible. And watching you finally stop doing that, watching you stand up and say, this is who I am, this is what I know, and you're wrong. That's not going too far. That's about damn time. Grace had felt tears prick her eyes. What if they win? What if all of this, the publicity, the lawsuit, the testimony, what if it doesn't matter and they just bury me anyway? Then at least you'll know you fought. At least Ethan Walker's death won't be invisible. They'd sat in silence for a while, drinking wine, both of them thinking about all the invisible deaths, all the preventable tragedies that got filed away as complications and moved on from. Finally, Olivia had asked the question Grace had been dreading. Mom, do you ever regret it, leaving the military, going into civilian nursing instead of staying where your skills were appreciated? Every single day, Grace had admitted, but I couldn't stay. After Havoc died, after I realized I'd spent 6 years watching good people die for missions I didn't always believe in, I needed to do something where I was saving lives, not just patching them up to send back into danger. And instead, you ended up watching them die in a hospital because of negligence. Yeah, that's got to be worse somehow. It is, because in Afghanistan, at least the threat was external. Enemy fire IEDs the terrain. Here, the threat is apathy, bureaucracy, doctors too proud to admit they don't know everything. It's preventable, and that makes it so much worse. Olivia had refilled both their glasses. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Scared for you, but proud. The next morning, Grace had woken to her phone ringing, unknown number. She'd answered cautiously. Hello, Atom. Miss Miller, this is Diane Walker, Ethan's mother. Grace had sat up straight, her heart suddenly pounding. Mrs. Walker, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know. The woman's voice had been thick with grief but steady. I wanted to call and thank you for trying to save my son, for speaking up, for making sure everyone knows his death wasn't just something that happened. He deserved better care. He did, and I'm told you're the only person in that hospital who tried to give it to him. A pause. The hospital's lawyers contacted me. They want to settle our lawsuit quietly. Offer us money to make this go away. Grace had closed her eyes. What did you tell them? I told them I want a trial. I want everyone to hear exactly what happened to Ethan. I want that doctor's face on the news. I want other families to know what Cascade Veterans Medical Center does to veterans. Another pause. But my lawyer says our case is stronger if your case goes forward too. That we're better together than separate. So I'm asking, are you going to keep fighting even if it costs you everything? Grace had thought about Ethan's face slack and blue under that oxygen mask, about Ranger howling from 3 floors down, about every veteran she had watched fall through the cracks because the system was too broken to catch them. Yes, she'd said, I'm going to keep fighting. Then so will I. They talked for another 20 minutes. Diane had shared stories about Ethan, how bright he'd been before Afghanistan, how the war had changed him, how hard he'd fought to rebuild himself afterward, how Ranger had been the only thing that helped him sleep through the night, the only presence that could pull him back when the flashbacks got too intense. He told me once, Diane had said, her voice breaking, he said, Mom, Ranger is the only one who sees me the way I was before. Everyone else sees the broken version, but Ranger just sees me. And then they took Ranger away from him, and my son died alone and terrified, and I'll never forgive them for that. After the call ended, Grace had sat in her quiet apartment and let herself cry. Not for herself, not for her career or her reputation or any of it. For Ethan Walker, who'd survived 2 tours in hell only to die in an American hospital because nobody would listen to his dog. Then she dried her eyes, made coffee, and started preparing for war. The war started small in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. She'd expected the hospital's legal assault, the depositions, the media scrutiny. What she hadn't expected was the personal cost showing up in grocery store aisles and coffee shops. The first incident happened 3 days after her deposition. Grace had been buying milk at her neighborhood Safeway when a woman in scrubs approached her. Grace recognized her vaguely radiology tech from Cascade maybe, or lab work. You should be ashamed of yourself, the woman had said loud enough that other shoppers turned to look. Dr. Cross is a good man. He's helped thousands of veterans, and you're destroying his career over one patient who was probably going to die anyway. Grace had stood there, milk carton in hand, stunned into silence. People like you give nurses a bad name, the woman had continued, always thinking you know better than the doctors, always causing problems. I hope they sue you for everything you have. She'd walked away before Grace could respond. Grace had abandoned her cart and left the store, her hands shaking too badly to hold anything. She'd sat in her car for 20 minutes trying to breathe normally before she could drive home. Olivia had been furious when Grace told her, "Give me her name. I'll file a complaint for harassment." "It doesn't matter." "Mom, it does matter. You can't let people live. If I react every time someone says something cruel, I'll spend my entire life fighting. I have to pick my battles." But the incidents kept coming. Anonymous messages on social media calling her a liar, a troublemaker, mentally unstable. Someone had created a fake Facebook page using her name and photo posting deranged rants about hating doctors. Sarah had gotten it taken down, but not before several news outlets had screenshot it as evidence of Grace's instability. Then the hospital had escalated. They'd filed a motion to get Grace's full psychiatric records entered into evidence, not just the evaluations from her Article 15, but everything. Every therapy session since Afghanistan, every medication she'd been prescribed, every vulnerable moment she'd shared with a counselor, now potentially public record. Sarah had fought it. "This is a fishing expedition. They're hoping to find something embarrassing enough to force you to settle." The hearing had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Grace had arrived at the courthouse to find a handful of protesters, some supporting her, some calling her a fraud. News cameras everywhere. She'd kept her head down and walked inside. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison, had listened to both sides for 40 minutes before making her ruling. The hospital's request is overly broad and potentially violative of medical privacy protections. However, given that Miss Miller has publicly discussed her PTSD diagnosis and treatment, I'm allowing limited disclosure. Specifically, any psychiatric records from the 6 months immediately preceding and following the incident in question. The hospital wants to argue her judgment was impaired, fine, but they don't get to put her entire mental health history on trial. It was a partial win. Grace had still left the courthouse, knowing that her therapy notes from the months after Ethan died, when she'd been processing the guilt and anger and helplessness, would be handed over to Cross's lawyers. Sarah had tried to reassure her. It's not as bad as it could have been. They're going to read about me crying in therapy because I couldn't save him. They're going to see me admitting I had nightmares about his face. And they're going to use it to prove I was emotionally compromised. Or they're going to see a dedicated nurse who was so affected by a patient's preventable death that she sought help processing it. That's not weakness, Grace. That's what mentally healthy people do. Grace had wanted to believe her. 2 weeks later, the hospital had made their next move. They'd subpoenaed Amanda Chen, the night nurse who'd spoken to the media. Amanda had called Grace in tears. They're saying if I don't testify against you, they'll fire me for violating confidentiality. Grace, I have 2 kids. I can't lose this job. I'm so sorry. What do they want you to say? That you were obsessed with Ethan's case, that you talked about him constantly, that you seemed personally affected, that you cried after he died. They want me to make you sound unstable. Grace had felt sick. Tell them the truth, Amanda. Whatever that is. I'm not asking you to lie for me. But it'll hurt your case. The truth is the truth. If it hurts, then it hurts. But I won't ask you to perjure yourself or lose your job because of me. Amanda had testified the following Monday. Grace hadn't been allowed in the courtroom. Witnesses couldn't observe each other's testimony, but Sarah had given her the summary afterward. She said you seemed very invested in Ethan's case, that you were visibly upset when he died, that you talked about it extensively with other nurses. But she also said, and this is important, that everything you told them was medically accurate, that your concerns about his treatment were shared by other staff, that you were upset because a preventable death had occurred, not because you were mentally unstable. So mixed. Honestly, better than I expected. Cross's lawyer tried to make her say you were erratic or unprofessional, and she wouldn't. She held firm that you were a good nurse who'd witnessed something terrible. Small victories. Grace was learning to appreciate them. But the hospital wasn't done. The next subpoena went to Grace's therapist, Dr. Ellen Reeves. Ellen had been seeing Grace on and off since she'd left the military, helping her work through PTSD symptoms and transition back to civilian life. Ellen had called Grace immediately. I'm legally required to comply, but I want you to know I'm going to fight to keep as much privileged as possible. And Grace, nothing you've ever told me suggests you are unstable or unreliable. If they put me on that stand, I'm going to make that very clear. The deposition had happened on a rainy Thursday. Grace had waited in Sarah's office, drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about every vulnerable thing she'd ever shared in therapy being picked apart by lawyers. Sarah had come back 3 hours later looking grim. They asked her about your nightmares, your panic attacks, your feelings of guilt about not saving Ethan. Ellen held her ground. She kept emphasizing that your responses were normal reactions to trauma, not evidence of impaired judgment. But Grace, they got what they wanted. They have a therapist on record confirming you had strong emotional reactions to this case, which I've never denied. I know, but juries hear nightmares and panic attacks, and they think unstable, not traumatized. We need to get ahead of this. Sarah had outlined her strategy. Instead of trying to hide Grace's PTSD or minimize it, they'd lean into it. They'd call expert witnesses to explain that emotional responses to patient deaths were normal and healthy, that caring deeply about patients was a strength, not a liability, that Grace's combat medicine experience made her uniquely qualified to recognize veteran crisis. We make your trauma the reason you were right, not the reason you were wrong, Sarah had explained. It's risky, but it's the only play we have. Grace had agreed because she had no other choice. The trial date had been set for 8 weeks out. Grace had spent those weeks in a strange limbo, suspended from work, unable to find another nursing job because of the pending lawsuit, watching her savings drain away on legal fees despite Sarah's reduced rate. Olivia had offered money. Grace had refused. You have your own life, your own expenses. I'm not taking your savings because of my choices. Mom, don't be ridiculous. I mean it, Liv. This is my fight. But the financial pressure had been crushing. Grace's apartment rent, her car payment, her medical insurance, now that she wasn't employed, it added up fast. She'd started selling things. Her TV, some furniture, jewelry she'd inherited from her mother. She'd been looking at her bedroom dresser, trying to decide what else she could bear to part with, when her eyes had landed on the shadow box at the back of her closet, the one she'd shoved there 15 years ago and tried to forget about. She'd pulled it out, brushed off the dust. Inside, carefully arranged her Navy Commendation Medal, Her combat medic badge, several unit citations, and a photo of her with Havoc. The Belgian Malinois looked alert and confident, his eyes bright. Grace in the photo looked young and certain, like she believed she could save the world. She'd stared at that shadow box for a long time. Then she'd taken a photo of it with her phone and posted it on social media with a simple caption, "This is who I was before I became just a nurse. This is why I know what combat trauma looks like. This is why I spoke up." The post had gone viral within hours. Veterans groups had shared it. Active duty service members had commented. The SEALs she'd served with had started posting their own stories about her. One comment had particularly struck her. From a SEAL named Jake Morrison, who she barely remembered, "Doc Miller once treated my sucking chest wound while taking incoming fire. She was calm, competent, and saved my life. 15 years later, some hospital lawyer wants to say she can't be trusted because she has PTSD. That PTSD came from saving people like me. Anyone who questions her judgment can answer to the SEAL community." The comment had gotten 12,000 likes. The hospital's PR team had scrambled to respond, but the narrative had shifted again. Suddenly, Grace wasn't an unstable nurse with a grudge. She was a decorated combat veteran being attacked for speaking truth to power. Cross's lawyers had filed an emergency motion to exclude any mention of Grace's military service from the trial, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant. Judge Morrison had denied it. If the hospital wants to make this case about Miss Miller's mental state and credibility, then her military service and the context of her PTSD diagnosis are absolutely relevant. You can't have it both ways, counselor. Motion denied. That had been the first moment Grace had felt like maybe possibly she might actually win. But winning came with a price she hadn't anticipated. The media attention had grown intense. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests. Someone had leaked her address, and she'd started getting mail, some supportive, some threatening. One letter written in careful block print had said, "Veterans like Ethan Walker are better off dead than living with PTSD. You didn't save anyone, you just prolonged suffering. Do everyone a favor and follow him." Grace had stared at that letter for a long time before crumpling it up and throwing it away. Then she'd pulled it back out of the trash and given it to Sarah, who'd given it to the police. "You need to take this seriously," Sarah had said. "Someone threatening suicide by proxy against a public figure that's concerning. It's one angry person with a keyboard. It's a potential safety threat. I'm getting you security for the trial. I can't afford." The Veterans Advocacy group is covering it. Non-negotiable, Grace. So Grace had ended up with a bodyguard. Former Marine named David Torres, quiet and professional, who followed her everywhere and made her feel simultaneously safer and more exposed. "Is this really necessary?" she'd asked him after the first day. "Ma'am, I've seen what happens when high-profile cases turn ugly. People get invested, they get emotional, sometimes they get violent. I'd rather be bored than planning your funeral." The bluntness had been oddly comforting. 3 weeks before trial, Grace had gotten a call from an unknown number. She'd almost ignored it, but something had made her answer. "Miss Miller, this is Colonel James Patterson, U.S. Army. I'm calling about your upcoming testimony before Congress." Grace had frozen. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs wants you to testify about VA hospital oversight and veteran care standards. They've been following your case and believe your perspective would be valuable. Would you be willing to appear?" Yes, absolutely." "Excellent. My office will send you the details." "And Miss Miller, what you're doing, speaking up despite the personal cost that takes real courage, the Army appreciates it." After he'd hung up, Grace had sat in stunned silence. Then she'd called Olivia. "Mom, do you understand what this means? Congressional testimony doesn't just support your case, it legitimizes it. It says the federal government thinks veteran care is a serious enough problem that they want your input on fixing it. Or it makes me look like a political crusader instead of a nurse trying to tell the truth. Either way, it changes the optics. Cross's team has been painting you as an isolated troublemaker. This makes you a national advocate." The congressional testimony had been scheduled for 2 weeks before the trial. Grace had spent days preparing with a committee staffer, going over her statement, anticipating questions. The morning of the hearing, Grace had put on her most professional clothes and driven to Washington, D.C., with David Torres following in a second car. Olivia had taken leave to be there, sitting in the audience in her dress uniform. The hearing room had been intimidating high ceilings, formal set-up senators arrayed in a semicircle. Grace had been sworn in, her hand shaking slightly on the Bible. Senator Robert Chen, chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee, had started gently. "Miss Miller, thank you for being here. Can you walk us through what happened the night Ethan Walker died?" Grace had told the story again. Every detail, every warning, every ignored protocol. Her voice had stayed steady, factual, clear. Then Senator Chen had asked the question that changed everything. "Miss Miller, in your professional opinion, how common are incidents like this? Is what happened to Ethan Walker an isolated failure, or is it part of a larger systemic problem?" Grace had taken a breath. "Senator, in my 15 years as a VA nurse, I've seen dozens of cases where veteran patients received inadequate care because medical staff didn't understand combat trauma, where service dogs were treated as pets instead of medical equipment, where PTSD was handled as a behavioral problem instead of a medical condition. Ethan Walker's case is the most extreme example I've personally witnessed. But the underlying issues, the disconnect between what veterans need and what the VA system provides, that's endemic. And in your view, what needs to change?" This was it. The moment Grace could either play it safe or say what really needed to be said. She'd chosen truth. The VA needs to require combat trauma training for all staff who work with veterans, not just psychiatric specialists. We need to recognize service dogs as medical equipment that cannot be separated from their handlers, except in genuine emergencies. We need formal protocols for when medical staff raise concerns about patient care, so nurses and junior doctors can't be dismissed by senior physicians who refuse to consider alternative approaches. And we need accountability, real accountability when veterans die due to negligence. Senator Marsha Williams, a Democrat from California, had leaned forward. "Miss Miller, you're currently being sued by Cascade Veterans Medical Center for defamation and facing termination. Do you believe you're being retaliated against for speaking up?" "Yes, ma'am, I do. And yet you're here testifying publicly, which will likely make that retaliation worse." "Why?" Grace had looked directly at the senator. "Because Ethan Walker can't speak for himself anymore. Because his mother deserves to know his death meant something. Because there are veterans right now today in VA hospitals across this country who are being treated by staff who don't understand their trauma, who dismiss their service dogs, who see them as difficult patients instead of people who sacrificed everything for this country. If my testimony helps change that, then whatever happens to me is worth it." The hearing room had been quiet for a moment. Then Senator Williams had said, "Thank you for your service, Miss Miller, both in combat and now." The hearing had lasted 3 hours. Grace had answered every question, provided every detail, held nothing back. When it was over, she'd walked out to find a crowd of veterans waiting in the hallway, some in uniform, some in motorcycle vests with veteran patches, all of them wanting to shake her hand or thank her. One old man, Vietnam era by his patches, had gripped her hand hard. "My son died in a VA hospital 5 years ago. Pneumonia they didn't catch fast enough because nobody listened when he said something was wrong. His death got buried in paperwork. Thank you for not letting this one get buried." Grace had driven back to Seattle that night, exhausted and wrung out. But she'd also felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Maybe this was bigger than just her case. Maybe something good could actually come from Ethan's death. The hospital had responded to her congressional testimony with a furious press release, accusing her of grandstanding and using Ethan Walker's death for political purposes. They'd filed another motion to exclude the testimony from trial evidence. Judge Morrison had denied it again. Miss Miller's testimony before Congress speaks directly to her credibility and the systemic issues underlying this case. It's admissible. Stop filing frivolous motions, counselor. 1 week before trial, Sarah had called an emergency meeting. "Grace, I need to show you something." She'd pulled out a stack of medical records. "Remember how we subpoenaed Cross's patient files looking for pattern evidence? We found something." Grace had looked at the records. They showed 5 other veteran patients who'd been treated by Dr. Cross in the past 3 years. All 5 had experienced adverse events. 2 had died. All 5 cases showed the same pattern: nursing staff raising concerns, Cross dismissing them, outcomes deteriorating. "This is huge," Sarah had said. "This isn't about you being overly emotional or Ethan being an isolated incident. This is about Cross having a documented history of ignoring warnings and prioritizing his judgment over patient safety. Can we use this at trial?" "Absolutely. It goes to pattern and practice. Cross's whole defense is that he made a reasonable medical judgment that happened to have a bad outcome. These records prove he makes the same reasonable judgment over and over, and people keep dying. Grace had felt her hands start shaking. We can prove it. We can actually prove it wasn't just me, wasn't just Ethan, wasn't just one bad night. We can prove it was negligence. Systematic, documented, repeated negligence. Sarah had paused. Grace, this changes the calculus. The hospital has to know we found this. Discovery goes both ways. I expect them to come back with a serious settlement offer. Probably in the next 48 hours. Big money, full reinstatement, glowing references, the works. They're going to want this to go away before these records become public at trial. And if they do, that's your decision. You can take the money, get your life back, move on, or you can go to trial, make this public, and risk losing everything if the jury doesn't side with us. Grace had looked at those medical records. 5 families, 5 veterans who deserved better, 5 deaths that should have triggered investigations and reforms and consequences, but instead had been filed away as unfortunate complications. I want to call Diane Walker, she'd said. She'd made the call that night, explained what they'd found, explained the likely settlement offer, explained that if Grace took it, Diane's case would probably have to settle too. The evidence wouldn't be public, and without Grace's testimony, the wrongful death suit would be much harder to win. So you're asking my permission to turn down money you desperately need, Diane had said slowly. I'm asking what you want. What would honor Ethan's memory? Diane had been quiet for a long time. I want a trial. I want a jury to hear what they did to my son. I want those medical records entered into evidence so other families can use them. I want Dr. Cross to have to sit in that courtroom and listen to everything he did wrong. I don't want money. I want justice. Even if we lose, at least we tried. At least Ethan's death wasn't invisible. Grace had thanked her and hung up. 2 days later, exactly as Sarah predicted, the hospital's lawyers had called with a settlement offer. $2 million full reinstatement with back pay, sealed records, mutual non-disparagement agreement. Sarah had relayed the offer. Grace, this is life-changing money. You'd never have to worry about finances again. You could retire, travel, live comfortably, and they'd have to take you back with full benefits. What about the medical records, the pattern evidence? Sealed. Part of the settlement would be that nothing from discovery gets released publicly. So those 5 families never know their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented. Future patients never know Cross has a history of negligence. The VA never knows these systemic problems exist. That's how settlements work. Both sides agree to make it go away. Grace had thought about Ethan restrained and dying, about Ranger howling, about Diane Walker saying her son's death wouldn't be invisible. Tell them no. Grace, tell them I want a trial. I want everything public. I want a jury to decide whether what happened to Ethan Walker was acceptable medical care or negligence. Tell them no amount of money will make me agree to bury this. Sarah had smiled slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. Let's go to war. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in November. Grace had walked into that courthouse with David Torres beside her, Olivia in uniform 3 steps behind, and Sarah carrying 2 banker's boxes full of evidence. The media circus outside had been massive news vans, protesters on both sides, veterans holding signs that read, "Justice for Ethan," and "Nurses Save Lives." Inside, the courtroom had felt smaller than Grace expected. She'd taken her seat at the plaintiff's table and looked across the aisle at Dr. Nathan Cross for the first time since Ethan died. He'd been wearing an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expression one of calm confidence. Like this was an inconvenience he'd tolerate before getting back to his important work. Grace had felt anger burn hot in her chest. Jury selection had taken 2 days. Sarah had used every challenge to eliminate anyone with obvious bias against nurses or veterans, anyone who seemed too deferential to doctors. The hospital's lawyers had done the opposite, trying to pack the jury with people who'd trust a psychiatrist over a nurse. They'd ended up with 12 jurors, 7 women, 5 men, ranging from a retired teacher to a software engineer to a construction foreman. 3 of them had family members who'd served in the military. That was something. Opening statements had begun on Wednesday morning. The hospital's attorney, Robert Vance, had gone first. He'd been smooth, professional, sympathetic. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a tragedy. Ethan Walker was a veteran who suffered terribly from PTSD, and despite the best efforts of Cascade Veterans Medical Center's staff, he died. That's heartbreaking. That's devastating. But it's not negligence. Dr. Nathan Cross is a board-certified psychiatrist with 15 years of experience treating combat trauma. He made medical judgments based on his training and expertise. Those judgments, unfortunately, didn't lead to the outcome anyone wanted. But medicine isn't perfect. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, patients die. Vance had paused, letting that sink in. The plaintiff wants you to believe that a nurse with an associate degree knew better than a doctor with a medical degree in psychiatric specialization. That's simply not credible. Miss Miller is a dedicated nurse who cared deeply about her patients, perhaps too deeply. Her own therapist will testify that she became emotionally overwrought by Mr. Walker's death, that she had nightmares about it, that her PTSD from military service made her unable to view this case objectively. She convinced herself that if only Dr. Cross had listened to her, everything would have been fine. But that's not medicine. That's emotion. And we cannot allow emotion to override medical expertise. Grace had watched the jury's faces. Some looked skeptical, others nodded slightly. Vance had continued. You'll hear from multiple medical experts who will testify that Dr. Cross's decisions were within the standard of care for treating acute PTSD episodes. You'll hear that Ethan Walker had multiple comorbidities, substance abuse history, probable cardiac issues that made him a high-risk patient regardless of treatment approach. You'll hear that sometimes tragically patients die not because of negligence, but because medicine has limits. He'd sat down looking satisfied. Sarah had stood up, and Grace had seen something shift in her posture, the lawyer disappearing, the advocate emerging. Mr. Vance just told you this case is about a tragic death despite everyone's best efforts. That's a lie. This case is about a preventable death because one doctor refused to listen. Let me tell you what actually happened on the night Ethan Walker died. Sarah had walked the jury through it. Every warning Grace gave, every protocol Cross violated, every moment the situation deteriorated while Cross dismissed concerns. Grace Miller didn't just care deeply about her patient. She was right. Ethan Walker's medication chart clearly stated he had adverse reactions to Haldol. Grace pointed this out. Dr. Cross ignored her. Ethan Walker's service dog was trained to protect him during PTSD episodes. Grace explained this. Dr. Cross separated them anyway. Ethan Walker's vital signs showed he was experiencing respiratory distress. Grace called for intervention. Dr. Cross said to watch and wait. Sarah had turned to face the jury directly. The defense wants you to believe Grace's PTSD makes her unreliable. Let me tell you what her PTSD actually means. It means she spent 3 tours in Afghanistan treating wounded soldiers under fire. It means she saved lives in conditions most of us can't imagine. It means she knows what combat trauma looks like from both sides as a medic and as someone who survived it. And it means when she saw a veteran in crisis, she recognized what he needed because she'd been there herself. Sarah had paused, her voice dropping. The hospital offered Grace $2 million to make this case go away. $2 million to agree that Ethan Walker's death was just an unfortunate complication. She said no, because this isn't about money. This is about making sure what happened to Ethan Walker, a veteran who survived 2 tours in Afghanistan only to die in an American hospital because nobody would listen to his dog, doesn't happen to anyone else. Grace had watched several jurors lean forward. You're going to hear from 5 other families whose loved ones died or nearly died under Dr. Cross's care. You're going to see a pattern of dismissing warnings, ignoring protocol, and prioritizing ego over patient safety. And then you're going to ask yourselves, was this a tragic accident or was this negligence? I think you'll know the answer. Sarah had sat down. Grace had reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. The first witness had been the ER doctor who'd initially assessed Ethan. Young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable being there. Dr. Martinez, Vance had asked, when the patient arrived, what was your assessment? Severe PTSD, episode, acute agitation, probable flashback state, and you called for psychiatric consultation. Yes, the patient needed specialized care beyond what I could provide. Did you have any concerns about how Dr. Cross handled the case? Martinez had hesitated. No, he's the specialist. I deferred to his expertise. Did Miss Miller express concerns to you? She said something about the dog being important, but I didn't have time to focus on that. We had other patients. Sarah had cross-examined carefully. Dr. Martinez, when Miss Miller told you the service dog was important, did you investigate what she meant? No. Did you check the patient's medical history for any information about his service dog? No, I didn't think it was medically relevant. But Miss Miller thought it was relevant. She seemed to, yes. And she was the only staff member who'd bothered to observe the dog's behavior and the patient's response to the dog. I suppose so. Thank you, doctor. The next witness had been the security guard who'd removed Ranger. Big guy uncomfortable in a suit, clearly not happy to be testifying. Under Vance's questioning, he'd described Ranger as aggressive and dangerous. The dog was growling, teeth bared, lunging at staff. We had to use the catch pole for safety. Sarah had stood for cross-examination. Mr. Hendricks, did the dog ever actually bite anyone? Well, no, but did the dog leave his position in front of the patient to attack anyone? No, but he was aggressive. Or was he positioned between his handler and approaching people, which is what protection-trained dogs are supposed to do? I don't know about dog training, ma'am. I know he was growling. Miss Miller told you the dog was protecting, not attacking. Did you consider that, look, a nurse doesn't tell security how to do our job? But she was right, wasn't she? The dog never attacked anyone. He was doing exactly what she said, protecting his handler. Hendricks had shifted uncomfortably. Maybe. I don't know. The testimony had continued like that for 3 days. Hospital staff defending their actions, Sarah methodically exposing the gaps in their reasoning. The head nurse who'd helped restrain Ethan admitting she'd never checked his medication allergies. The resident who'd dismissed Grace's concerns about respiratory distress, admitting he'd been too tired to properly assess the situation. Then came Dr. Ellen Reeves, Grace's therapist. Vance had questioned her aggressively. Dr. Reeves, you treated Miss Miller for PTSD-related symptoms, correct? I provided therapy for post-traumatic stress, yes. And after Ethan Walker's death, Miss Miller's symptoms worsened. She experienced grief and distress, which is normal after losing a patient. She had nightmares specifically about Mr. Walker. Yes. She cried during sessions when discussing the case. Yes. She expressed feelings of guilt and responsibility. She processed complex emotions around the situation, yes. Would you say she was emotionally stable during this period? Ellen had looked directly at Vance. I would say she was experiencing a normal grief response to a traumatic event. Counselor crying about a patient's preventable death isn't instability. It's humanity. If Miss Miller hadn't been affected by what happened to Ethan Walker, that would concern me much more than the fact that she was. Vance had tried to recover, but her emotional state could have affected her judgment. Her emotional state developed after Mr. Walker's death. Her medical observations and warnings happened before and during the crisis. The timeline you're suggesting doesn't support your argument. Sarah hadn't even needed to cross-examine. Ellen had already made the point perfectly. But the real turning point had come when Sarah called her expert witness, Dr. James Patterson, Army psychiatrist specialist in combat trauma, the same colonel who'd contacted Grace about congressional testimony. Patterson had walked the jury through everything. How service dogs function for PTSD patients. Why separating Ethan from Ranger was the worst possible intervention. How Cross's medication choices showed a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma-based crisis versus psychotic break. Dr. Cross treated Ethan Walker like he was having a psychiatric emergency requiring sedation and restraint, Patterson had explained. But Mr. Walker was having a trauma response. His brain believed he was back in combat. The service dog was the only thing tethering him to present reality. Removing that anchor was like cutting a drowning man's lifeline and being surprised when he went under. Vance had tried to shake him on Cross. Dr. Patterson, you've never met Miss Miller before this case, correct? That's incorrect. I met Miss Miller in 2009 when she was a combat medic attached to my unit in Afghanistan. She was one of the finest trauma specialists I've worked with. The courtroom had gone silent. You failed to disclose this relationship in your expert report, Vance had said, trying to regain footing. I disclosed that I had previous military service with the plaintiff. If you failed to read that section of my report, that's not my problem. Several jurors had smiled. Patterson had continued. And frankly, counselor, my prior knowledge of Miss Miller's abilities only strengthens my opinion in this case. I've seen her treat battlefield trauma under the worst possible conditions. I've seen her make split-second decisions that saved lives. I know she's capable of recognizing veteran crisis. So when she tells me she warned Dr. Cross multiple times that his approach was dangerous, I believe her. Because I've watched her be right about combat medicine more times than I can count. That testimony had lasted 4 hours. By the end, even Vance had looked exhausted. Then Sarah had done something Grace hadn't expected. She'd called Amanda Chen to the stand as her own witness, not the hospital's. Miss Chen, you testified earlier that Grace seemed very invested in Ethan Walker's case. Can you elaborate? Amanda had nodded. Grace talked about him a lot. She was worried. She kept saying something was wrong with his treatment plan. Did her concerns seem irrational to you? No, she was specific. She pointed out the medication issue, the service dog, separation, the respiratory problems. She wasn't being emotional, she was being clinical. How long have you worked with Grace? 12 years. In that time, has she ever shown poor judgment with patients? Never. Grace is the nurse everyone wants when things go wrong. She stays calm, she catches things other people miss, she advocates hard for her patients. Even when doctors dismiss her, Amanda had smiled sadly. Especially when doctors dismiss her. Grace doesn't care about ego or hierarchy. She cares about whether the patient is getting what they need. One more question, Miss Chen. The hospital pressured you to testify against Grace. Why are you here supporting her instead? Because I watched a veteran die when he shouldn't have. And I watched Grace try everything to prevent it. And if I stay quiet now to protect my job, then I'm just as complicit as everyone else who knew something was wrong and said nothing. The hospital's lawyers had objected, called for a mistrial, argued Amanda was a hostile witness. Judge Morrison had denied everything and told them to move on. That evening, Sarah had looked exhausted but hopeful. We're in good shape. The jury's engaged, the evidence is strong, Patterson was perfect. When does Cross testify? Tomorrow, and Grace, you need to prepare yourself. Vance is going to put him up there looking sympathetic and professional. He's going to paint himself as a dedicated doctor who did everything right and is being persecuted by an unstable nurse. It's going to be hard to watch. It had been worse than hard. Dr. Nathan Cross had taken the stand in a perfectly tailored suit, his voice measured and sorrowful. Under Vance's gentle questioning, he described his extensive training, his dedication to veterans, his anguish over Ethan Walker's death. Dr. Cross, did you know the patient had a documented adverse reaction to Haldol? I knew he had a history of substance abuse, which can complicate medication responses. In my medical judgment, the benefits of rapid sedation outweighed the risks. Did Miss Miller express concerns about your treatment plan? She did. I appreciated her input, but ultimately I had to make the decision based on my psychiatric expertise. Nurses provide valuable observations, but they're not trained to make psychiatric treatment decisions. Did you ever intend to harm Mr. Walker? Cross's voice had cracked slightly. Absolutely not. I became a psychiatrist to help veterans. Losing Ethan, losing any patient is devastating. I've replayed that night 1,000 times, wondering if I could have done something differently. But based on the information I had and my medical training, I made the best decisions I could. He'd looked directly at the jury, his eyes sincere. I wish I could have saved him, I really do. Grace had felt sick watching it. The performance was perfect, just enough emotion to seem human, just enough professionalism to seem credible. Then Sarah had stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. Dr. Cross, you testified you made the best decisions you could based on the information available. Let's talk about what information was available. She'd pulled up Ethan's chart on the screen. This medication history entered by the admitting nurse clearly states adverse reaction to Haldol severe respiratory depression. You saw this before ordering the medication, correct? I saw the chart, yes. And you ordered Haldol anyway. As I said in my medical judgment, your medical judgment was that a documented adverse reaction could be ignored because you knew better. I weighed the risks. Did you consult with the pharmacist about alternative sedation options? No, but did you order respiratory monitoring to watch for the documented adverse reaction? The nursing staff was monitoring. Did you give any specific orders for what to do if the patient showed signs of respiratory distress? Cross had paused. I trusted the nursing staff to alert me if issues arose. They did alert you. Grace Miller specifically told you the patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. What did you do? I ordered increased oxygen and you refused to reverse the sedation, even though the patient was having the exact adverse reaction his chart said he would have. In my judgment, reversing sedation while he was still agitated would have been more dangerous. Sarah had turned to the jury. Your judgment. Let's talk about your judgment, Dr. Cross. How many patients have you lost in the past 3 years? Vance had objected. Relevance, Judge Morrison had overruled. The witness testified about his medical judgment. Examining the outcomes of that judgment is absolutely relevant. Answer the question, Dr. Cross. Cross had shifted in his seat. Medicine involves risk. Sometimes patients die despite how many? 7 patients in the 3 years. 7 patients. And how many of those cases involve nursing staff raising concerns about your treatment approach? I don't recall. Sarah had pulled out documents. Let me refresh your memory. Jennifer Martinez, age 29, Iraq veteran, died from medication interaction. Nurses documented concerns about drug combinations. You dismissed them. David Chen, age 34, Afghanistan veteran, died from aspiration pneumonia. Nurses requested he be kept NPO before a procedure. You said it was unnecessary. Should I continue? Cross's face had gone pale. Those were complex cases. They were preventable deaths. And in every single case, nursing staff tried to warn you, and you ignored them. Isn't that the real pattern here, Dr. Cross? Not that you make reasonable medical judgments that sometimes fail, but that you systematically ignore anyone who questions your decisions and people die as a result. That's not fair. Ethan Walker had 2 tours in Afghanistan. He survived combat. He survived IEDs and firefights and everything war could throw at him. And he died in your care because you couldn't set aside your ego long enough to listen to a nurse who actually understood what he needed. Objection. Vance was on his feet. Argumentative. Sustained, counsel rephrase. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Cross squirm, seen the pattern evidence, seen behind the professional facade to the arrogance underneath. Sarah had pressed harder. Dr. Cross, do you have any training in military working dog behavior? No, but do you have any personal experience with PTSD, service animals? I've read the literature. So when Grace Miller, a former K-9 handler who worked with military dogs in combat, told you that Ranger was protecting rather than attacking you, dismissed her based on what you're reading, I had to prioritize patient and staff safety. Ranger never bit anyone, never attacked anyone, never did anything except try to protect his handler. Grace was right, wasn't she? Cross's jaw tightened. In hindsight, not in hindsight, in the moment. She told you what would happen if you separated them. She told you Ethan would deteriorate. She told you he was having an adverse medication reaction. She was right about everything, and you ignored her about everything. Why? I made medical judgments based on my expertise. Or you made assumptions based on your ego. You assumed a nurse couldn't possibly know something you didn't. You assumed your medical degree meant you were automatically right. And Ethan Walker paid for those assumptions with his life. The courtroom had been absolutely silent. Sarah had walked back to her table, then turned for one final question. Dr. Cross, if you could go back to that night, would you do anything differently? Cross had hesitated, clearly weighing his answer. Finally, I would hope for a better outcome, but I stand by my medical decisions. You stand by decisions that killed a man. Objection. Withdrawn. No further questions. Cross had left the stand looking shaken. Grace had watched him return to his table and seen for the first time doubt in his eyes. The trial had continued for another week. More witnesses, more experts, more evidence. But that cross-examination of Cross had been the turning point. The jury had seen him, really seen him, and they hadn't liked what they saw. Closing arguments had been scheduled for a Friday. Sarah had gone last, standing before the jury one final time. This case is simple. Grace Miller did her job. She observed her patient, recognized warning signs, and advocated for appropriate care. Dr. Cross ignored her because he believed his title made him infallible. Ethan Walker died because of that arrogance. You can't bring Ethan back, but you can send a message that in medicine, everyone's voice matters, that nurses who speak up should be listened to, not dismissed, that veterans deserve care from people who understand their trauma, and that when someone in power fails this badly, there are consequences. She'd sat down. Vance had given his closing about tragic outcomes and the limits of medicine and how they couldn't blame a doctor for making reasonable decisions that didn't work out. The jury had deliberated for 11 hours. Grace had waited in a conference room with Sarah Olivia and David Torres, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything except the clock. When the bailiff called them back, Grace's hands had been shaking so badly she'd had to clasp them together. The jury foreman, the construction worker, had stood. In the matter of Miller versus Cascade Veterans Medical Center and Dr. Nathan Cross, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Grace had felt the world tilt. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $500,000. We award punitive damages in the amount of $2.5 million. The courtroom had erupted. Grace had sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Judge Morrison had banged her gavel. Order: this court awards attorney fees and costs to the plaintiff. Dr. Cross, your medical license will be reviewed by the state medical board. This court is adjourned. Sarah had turned to Grace with tears in her eyes. We won. Grace, we actually won. Olivia had wrapped her mother in a fierce hug. Around them, the courtroom had descended into chaos, reporters rushing out to file stories, veterans cheering, the hospital's legal team looking shell-shocked. Grace had looked across the aisle one last time. Dr. Cross had been sitting motionless, staring at the table. She'd felt no satisfaction in his defeat, just exhaustion and grief for all the deaths that could have been prevented if someone had listened sooner. Outside the courthouse, Grace had faced a wall of cameras and microphones. She'd stood on the steps, Olivia beside her, Sarah on her other side, and tried to find words. Ethan Walker deserved better. Every veteran deserves better. This verdict doesn't bring him back, but maybe it means the next veteran in crisis will be heard. Maybe it means the next nurse who speaks up won't be dismissed. Maybe it means something changes. Someone had called out, "What are you going to do now?" Grace had thought about her empty apartment, her suspended nursing license, the months of legal battle and financial stress and public scrutiny. Then she thought about Ethan's mother, about the 5 other families, about every veteran who'd ever been failed by a system that should have protected them. I'm going to make sure this meant something, she'd said. I'm going to fight for real reform, real accountability, real change. And she'd meant every word. The victory should have felt sweeter. Grace had won $3 million vindication in national headlines, declaring her a hero who'd stood up against medical negligence. But 2 days after the verdict, she'd woken up at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding, drenched in sweat, seeing Ethan Walker's blue face every time she closed her eyes. Winning the trial hadn't brought him back. It hadn't undone that night. And sitting alone in her apartment with a check she couldn't bring herself to cash, Grace had realized the fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. She'd called Sarah at 7 that morning. I want to use the money to start a foundation for veteran advocacy, for training medical staff on combat trauma, for making sure what happened to Ethan doesn't happen again. Sarah had been quiet for a moment. Grace, that's a beautiful idea, but you need to think practically. That money could set you up for life. You could retire, rest, heal from everything you've been through. I can't rest knowing there are veterans out there right now getting the same treatment Ethan got. I can't heal while the system that killed him is still operating exactly the same way. You've already sacrificed so much. Then what's a little more? 3 weeks later, the Ethan Walker Foundation had filed incorporation papers. Grace had put $2 million into it, kept $500,000 for living expenses and her own recovery, and donated the rest to cover legal fees for other families pursuing medical negligence cases. The foundation's mission had been simple: train medical staff to recognize and properly treat veteran PTSD, advocate for legal protections for service animals in medical settings, and provide support for families navigating VA hospital failures. Grace had expected it to be a small operation, maybe help a few families a year, maybe do some local training seminars. Within 2 months, she'd received over 3,000 requests for help. The calls had come from everywhere. A wife in Texas whose husband had been forcibly separated from his service dog during a psychiatric hold. A mother in Florida whose son had died after V. A doctor's dismissed his complaints of chest pain as anxiety. A veteran in Oregon who'd been denied treatment because staff said his service dog was too disruptive. Grace had tried to handle them all personally at first. She'd spent 16-hour days on the phone reviewing medical records, connecting families with lawyers, crying with mothers who'd lost sons to preventable failures. Olivia had found her one night still at her kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by case files and half-empty coffee cups. "Mom, you can't save them all. I have to try. You're going to burn yourself out, again, just like you did in Afghanistan." Grace had looked up at her daughter exhausted. "What else am I supposed to do, Liv? Pretend I don't know these families exist. Pretend I can't help." "I'm saying you need to build something sustainable. Hire staff. Create systems. You can't personally answer every call and investigate every case." "I don't know how to do that. I'm a nurse, not a nonprofit executive." "Then learn or find someone who knows. But you can't keep going like this." Olivia had been right. Grace had hired an executive director, a former VA administrator named Patricia Morgan, who'd left in disgust over the same systemic failures Grace was fighting. Patricia had brought structure, strategy, and the ability to scale. Within 6 months, the foundation had a staff of 12. They'd trained over 200 medical professionals on combat trauma recognition. They'd successfully lobbied for policy changes in 3 states requiring service animals be accommodated in medical settings. They'd helped 18 families win settlements or verdicts against negligent providers. Grace had become the public face of veteran medical advocacy. She'd testified before Congress twice more. She'd been interviewed on national news programs. She'd spoken at medical conferences, veteran rallies, nursing schools. And she'd discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. Better than she'd been at staying quiet and invisible. Her combat experience, her nursing background, her own PTSD, everything that had been used against her during the trial became her greatest asset in advocacy work. But the cost had been steep. Grace's PTSD symptoms had worsened under the constant stress. The nightmares had intensified. She'd started having panic attacks during public speaking engagements. Her therapist, Ellen, had gently suggested she needed to slow down. "Grace, you're trying to save every veteran because you couldn't save Ethan. That's not sustainable. That's not even possible." "I know it's not possible, but I have to try anyway." "Why?" Grace had struggled to articulate it. "Because if I stop, if I rest, then I have to sit with the fact that he's gone, and nothing I do will change that. As long as I'm fighting, as long as I'm helping other families, it feels like his death meant something. The moment I stop, it's just loss." Ellen had looked at her with compassion. "Grace, his death already means something. You've changed policy. You've saved lives. You've created a national conversation about veteran care. You don't have to destroy yourself to make his death meaningful." But Grace hadn't known how to stop. The breaking point had come 8 months after the trial. Grace had been invited to speak at a VA hospital in Denver, the same hospital where one of the families she'd helped had lost a son to medical negligence. She'd agreed, thinking it would be empowering, showing that institution they couldn't silence advocates. The presentation had started fine. Grace had been talking about recognizing PTSD symptoms, about the importance of listening to service animals, about creating trauma-informed care environments. Then a doctor in the back had raised his hand. "Miss Miller, with all due respect, you're asking us to completely change how we practice medicine based on one case. Don't you think you're being a bit dramatic?" Grace had frozen. The man's tone, his dismissive expression, the way he'd said, one case like Ethan's death was a statistical anomaly rather than a human tragedy, it had all collided in her mind. She'd seen Dr. Cross's face, heard his voice saying, "Just a nurse," felt the helplessness of watching Ethan die while everyone ignored her warnings. Her vision had tunneled. Her hands had started shaking. She'd opened her mouth to respond, and no words had come out. Patricia, sitting in the front row, had recognized what was happening. She'd stood up smoothly. "Let's take a 15-minute break. Miss Miller has been traveling all day." Patricia had guided Grace out of the conference room and into an empty office. Grace had collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she'd gasped. "I thought I could, but I can't. Every time someone dismisses what happened, every time someone acts like Ethan's death doesn't matter, I'm right back in that hospital room watching him die." Patricia had crouched down in front of her. "Grace, listen to me. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to be the one giving every speech, taking every interview, fighting every battle. That's why we built a team. That's why the foundation exists. You can step back. If I step back, who's going to fight for them? The staff you hired, the policies you helped create, the families you've empowered to tell their own stories. You've built something bigger than yourself. It doesn't need you to personally carry it anymore. Grace had looked at Patricia through tears. Then what do I do? You heal, you rest, you let other people continue the work while you take care of yourself. That night, Grace had called Olivia. I think I need to take a break. Thank God. Mom, I've been terrified you were going to have a complete breakdown. I almost did today, in front of a room full of doctors and veterans and advocates. Patricia had to cover for me. What happened? Grace had told her about the dismissive doctor, about the panic attack, about realizing she'd been running on rage and grief for so long, she'd forgotten how to function any other way. I don't know who I am if I'm not fighting, Grace had admitted. For 30 years I've been at war, first literally in Afghanistan, then figuratively in the hospital, then legally with the trial, then politically with the advocacy work. I don't know how to just exist. Olivia had been quiet for a long moment. Mom, do you remember when I was 8 and I fell off my bike and broke my arm? Of course. I was so scared to get back on the bike afterward. And you told me that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about doing the hard thing even when you're terrified. You said the bravest thing I could do was admit when I needed help. I remember. So here's me at 32 telling you the same thing. The bravest thing you can do right now is admit you need help. Admit you can't carry this alone anymore. Admit you're human. Grace had cried again, but this time it had felt different. Not panicked or desperate, just exhausted relief that someone had finally given her permission to stop. She'd taken a 6-month leave from the foundation. Patricia had taken over public-facing work. Grace had focused on therapy, on processing trauma she'd been carrying for 15 years, on learning to sit with grief instead of outrunning it. It hadn't been easy. For the first month, she'd woken up every morning feeling guilty for not working. She'd compulsively checked foundation emails, unable to let go. She'd had nightmares where Ethan Walker asked her why she'd given up. But slowly, with Ellen's help and Olivia's support, Grace had started to heal. Really heal, not just push through. She'd joined a veteran support group for the first time in her life. Sitting in a circle with other former service members, listening to their stories, sharing her own, it had been terrifying and cathartic. One veteran, a former Army Ranger named Mike, had said something that stuck with her. The war doesn't end when you come home. It ends when you finally stop fighting battles that are already over. Grace had realized she'd been fighting the same battle since Afghanistan, trying to save everyone, trying to prove she was worthy, trying to make up for the lives she couldn't save by saving every life she could reach now. But some battles couldn't be won by fighting harder. Some healing required surrender. 6 months later, Grace had returned to the foundation part-time. Not as the public face, not as the tireless advocate, but as a consultant. She'd reviewed cases, advised on policy-trained staff, but she'd also set boundaries. No more 16-hour days, no more taking every family's pain as her personal responsibility, no more sacrificing her own well-being for the mission. The foundation had not only survived without her constant presence, it had thrived. Patricia had expanded programs. The staff had developed new training protocols. 3 more states had passed service animal protection laws. Grace had been in Patricia's office when she'd learned about the latest victory. California had passed the Ethan Walker Service Animal Protection Act, mandating that VA hospitals accommodate service dogs during psychiatric care. We did it, Patricia had said, grinning. Actual legislative change. Ethan's name is in the law. Grace had felt tears well up, but this time they weren't from grief. They were from something she'd almost forgotten how to feel hope. His mother needs to know, Grace had said. She'd called Diane Walker that afternoon. They'd stayed in touch over the past year, occasional calls where they'd share updates and remember Ethan. Diane, they passed a law in California. It's called the Ethan Walker Act. Your son's name is going to protect other veterans. Diane had been silent for so long, Grace thought the call had dropped. Then she'd heard quiet crying. Thank you, Diane had finally whispered. Thank you for not letting him disappear. Thank you for making his death count for something. You did that by refusing to settle quietly, by insisting on a trial, by letting me tell his story. We did it together. They had, along with the 5 other families who'd come forward, along with Amanda Chen and the other nurses who'd risked their jobs to testify, along with Colonel Patterson and every veteran who'd shared Grace's story, along with Sarah Kim and Judge Morrison and the 12 jurors who'd said negligence had consequences. One person couldn't have done it, but all of them together had changed something. 3 months later, Grace had received an unexpected call. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs wanted to meet with her. She'd flown to Washington with Patricia, both of them nervous about what the meeting would entail. The VA could be proposing cooperation or preparing to fight the Foundation's advocacy work. Secretary James Reynolds had been in his late 50s, a former Marine with graying hair and tired eyes. He'd invited them into his office and closed the door. "Miss Miller, I'm going to be frank with you. When your case first made national news, I thought you were a troublemaker. Someone looking for attention and a payout." Grace had braced for an attack. "I was wrong," Reynolds had continued. "I've spent the past year reviewing VA hospital protocols for PTSD care. I've read reports from facilities across the country, and I've come to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. You were right. Our system is failing veterans. Not everywhere, not always, but consistently enough that it's a systemic problem, not isolated incidents." He'd pulled out a thick folder. "These are preliminary proposals for VA-wide policy reforms. Mandatory combat trauma training for all clinical staff, service animal accommodation protocols, formal escalation procedures when medical staff raise patient safety concerns. I'd like your Foundation's input on finalizing these." Grace had been stunned. "You want our help? I want to make sure we get this right. And you've spent the past year doing exactly what the VA should have been doing all along, listening to veterans, training providers, and holding institutions accountable when they fail. I'd be an idiot not to learn from that." The reforms had taken another 8 months to develop and implement. Grace had worked closely with VA officials, bringing in nurses and veterans and families to testify about what they needed. It had been exhausting and frustrating and bureaucratic, but it had also been real change. The new protocols had launched nationwide on the 2-year anniversary of Ethan Walker's death. Grace had been invited to speak at the announcement ceremony. She'd stood at the podium in the VA headquarters looking out at an audience of veterans, medical staff advocates, and politicians, and thought about how far she'd come from that night nurse everyone ignored. 2 years ago, a veteran named Ethan Walker died because the medical system failed him, because people in power wouldn't listen to the people who actually understood what he needed, because ego and hierarchy mattered more than patient care. Grace had paused, gathering herself. What happened to Ethan was a tragedy, but what would have been an even greater tragedy is if nothing changed. If his death was just another statistic, another unfortunate complication, another veteran who slipped through the cracks. She'd looked directly at the cameras. "These reforms won't save every veteran. Medicine is complex and people will still die despite our best efforts. But at least now when a nurse sees something wrong, there's a process for being heard. When a service dog is protecting its handler, there's a protocol that respects that bond. When a veteran is in crisis, the staff treating them will have actual training in combat trauma instead of just guessing." Grace had felt emotion rise in her throat. "I couldn't save Ethan Walker. I tried and I failed, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But because of him, because his mother refused to let his death be invisible, because other families came forward, because nurses finally spoke up, because veterans demanded better, the system changed. His death wasn't meaningless. It became a catalyst." She'd looked down at her prepared remarks, then set them aside. "For anyone watching this who's fighting the same battle I fought, who's trying to speak up and being dismissed, who's watching patients suffer and feeling powerless, who's wondering if one person can actually make a difference, I want you to know something. You're not powerless. Your voice matters. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet, even when staying quiet would be so much easier." The applause had been long and genuine. Grace had stepped away from the podium and found Olivia waiting in the wings, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you, Mom, not just for this, but for surviving everything it took to get here." They'd held each other while cameras flashed, while veterans came up to thank Grace, while Patricia fielded media requests. Later that night, back in her hotel room, Grace had video called Ellen for their regular therapy session. "How are you feeling?" Ellen had asked. "Tired, relieved, sad, hopeful, all of it at once. That sounds about right for someone who just changed national policy." Grace had smiled slightly. "I keep thinking about what Mike said in group, about the war ending when you stop fighting battles that are already over. I think maybe I'm finally getting there. I'm not trying to save everyone anymore. I'm not carrying the weight of every veteran death as my personal failure. I'm just doing what I can within my limits and letting that be enough. That's tremendous growth, Grace. It doesn't feel tremendous. It feels like I gave up on being a hero. Or you realized you didn't need to be a hero. You just needed to be human and honest and willing to keep trying even when it was hard. After the call ended, Grace had opened her laptop and looked at the foundation's website. There were now 17 staff members. They'd helped over 200 families. They'd trained more than 5,000 medical professionals. 3 states had passed protective legislation. None of it brought Ethan back, but all of it meant his death had mattered. Grace had pulled up a photo on her phone one Diane Walker had sent her months ago. It showed Ethan in his Army uniform standing next to Ranger, both of them looking young and strong and whole, and before Afghanistan broke them both. "I hope this is enough," Grace had whispered to the photo. "I hope you know we tried. I hope wherever you are, you're at peace." Her phone had buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss Miller, my name is Rebecca Torres. My brother died in a VA hospital last month. I saw your speech today. I think his death was negligent. I don't know what to do. Can you help?" Grace had stared at the text for a long moment. 2 years ago, she would have immediately called back, taken on the case personally, worked herself to exhaustion trying to save this family. Now she'd forwarded the message to Patricia with a note. "New case, please have our intake coordinator reach out. I'm available for consultation if needed, but taking the weekend off as planned." Then she turned off her phone, made herself tea, and sat in the quiet hotel room, allowing herself to rest. Because the work would always be there. There would always be more veterans who needed help, more families seeking justice, more systemic failures to fight. But Grace had learned finally that she couldn't pour from an empty cup, that taking care of herself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That being human with limits and needs and vulnerabilities didn't make her weak. It made her real. She'd returned to Seattle the next day and gone straight to the cemetery where Ethan Walker was buried. She'd visited a few times over the past 2 years, always alone, always struggling with what to say. This time she'd brought flowers and sat on the grass next to his headstone. "We did it," she'd said quietly. "Your name is in federal policy now. Your death changed things. I know that doesn't bring you back. I know it doesn't undo what happened. But it means something. You meant something." She'd traced the letters of his name carved in stone. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry no one listened until it was too late. I'm sorry you survived war, only to die in a place that should have kept you safe." The words had come easier than they ever had before. Maybe because Grace had finally forgiven herself for not being superhuman, for not being able to save everyone, for being just a nurse who did her best, and sometimes that wasn't enough. "Thank you," she'd added, "for being brave enough to keep fighting even when it was hard, for having Ranger who loved you enough to try to protect you until the end, for having a mother who refused to let you disappear. You deserve so much better than what happened. But at least now, because of you, other veterans might get what you deserved." Grace had sat there for a long time, listening to wind rustle through trees, feeling sun warm on her face, letting herself be present with grief instead of running from it. When she'd finally stood to leave, she'd felt lighter somehow. Not healed healing wasn't linear or complete, but lighter. Like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying for 2 years. She'd driven home, made dinner, called Olivia, just to chat about normal things. She'd watched television without checking work emails. She'd gone to bed at a reasonable hour. And when she'd woken at 3 in the morning from a nightmare about Afghanistan, she'd used the coping skills Ellen had taught her. She'd breathed slowly. She'd reminded herself she was safe. She'd gotten up and made tea instead of lying there panicking. Small victories. That's what recovery was made of. The next morning, Grace had gone to the foundation office for her scheduled consultation day. Patricia had handed her a stack of case files to review. "How was Washington?" Patricia had asked. "Good. Exhausting, but good. How were things here? Productive. We finalized the curriculum for the new training program. And Grace, 3 more states have reached out about introducing service animal protection bills. Your speech is making waves." Grace had felt pride and exhaustion in equal measure. "That's wonderful. Let's make sure we have capacity to support those efforts without burning out the team." Already on it, I learned from watching you almost destroy yourself, not making that mistake with our staff. Grace had smiled. Good, that's exactly why I hired you. She'd spent the morning reviewing cases, offering insights based on her medical background, connecting families with resources. Work she was good at, work that mattered, work she could do within her limits. During lunch, Amanda Chen had stopped by. They'd stayed close over the past 2 years, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Grace, I need to tell you something, Amanda had said, looking nervous. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Actually, something's really right. I'm leaving Cascade. I got accepted into a nurse practitioner program. And Grace, it's because of you. Watching you stand up, watching you fight, watching you prove that nurses' voices matter. It made me realize I'd been making myself small for years. I want to be the kind of provider who listens, who advocates, who doesn't dismiss concerns. I want to be like you. Grace had felt tears prick her eyes. Amanda, I'm so proud of you. You're going to be incredible. I'm terrified. Good. That means it matters. The things worth doing are always terrifying. After Amanda left, Grace had sat at her desk and let herself cry happy tears. This was the real victory, not policy changes or lawsuits or media attention, but individual people finding their voice, finding their courage, refusing to stay invisible. Ethan Walker's death had done that. His loss had rippled outward, changing not just systems, but people. Nurses who spoke up now, instead of staying silent. Veterans who demanded better care. Families who refused to accept complications as an explanation. One death shouldn't have been required to create that change. But since it was, at least it had meant something. Grace had finished her work, day-driven home, and done something she hadn't done in years. She'd pulled out her shadow box from the closet, the one with her medals and her photo with Havoc, and hung it on her living room wall. Not because she needed everyone to know she'd been a hero, but because she needed to remember that she'd always been more than just a nurse, that her experience mattered, that her voice mattered, that she mattered. The quiet nurse who everyone ignored had become the veteran advocate who changed federal policy. The woman who hid her combat medals had become the voice speaking truth to power. The person who'd buried her pain had become someone who transformed that pain into purpose. It hadn't been a straight line. There had been breakdowns and setbacks and moments where Grace had wanted to give up, but she'd kept going. And in the end, that was the real courage, not the dramatic stand or the heroic sacrifice, but the daily choice to keep trying even when it was hard. Grace looked at Ethan Walker's photo one more time, the one Diane had sent, and made a promise. I'll keep fighting, not at the point of destroying myself, but within my limits. I'll keep telling your story. I'll keep pushing for change. And I'll make sure that every veteran who comes after you has a better chance than you did. That was the mission now. Not to save everyone, because that was impossible, but to make the system better, to amplify voices that needed hearing, to ensure that when the next Grace Miller tried to speak up in the next hospital, someone would listen. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not titles or credentials or rank, not ego or hierarchy or procedure, but whether the people in power were willing to hear truth from voices they'd rather ignore, whether institutions valued protocol over people, whether one person speaking up could create change that saved lives. Grace had proved it could. Ethan Walker's death had proved it must. And every veteran who came after would benefit from both those truths, carved not just in policy and law, but in the transformed hearts of people who'd finally learned that sometimes the quiet voice in the back of the room was the one everyone should have been listening to all along.